Thanks for watching CyberNation Icam at the Edge, sponsored by GDIT. From the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network, I'm Mimi Gerges. Defense networks are under constant threat from attackers looking for a weakness. As joint and coalition forces connect more battlefield devices and use more sensor data, it's critical that zero trust principles are implemented to verify every point of access. Managing identity at the enterprise level is no longer enough. Credentialing must be dynamic and federated down to the tactical level on the ground. Joining me is Colonel Don Cloud. He is Deputy Director of Cyberspace Operations for Pacific Air Forces. Captain Brett O'Donovan is Division Director, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. And John Salen, Cyber Solutions Director for GDIT. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Captain O'Donovan, I want to start with you. Icam is Identity, Credential, and Access Management. Start by giving us an idea of Icam and how it's currently being used.
So one way we look at Icam is there end up being three components. There's the identifying and credentialing of the user, understanding that the user is who the user is, and the machine or network that user is accessing the data and information. The data and appropriate tagging of the data to ensure that you can align the attributes of that user to that data, and then the policies which assign which users are able to access which data. Each component of that is critical to ensuring security of the data.
And I want to talk about that a little bit more, but first, Colonel Cloud, I want to turn to you. What are your organization's priorities in the Pacific, and why is Icam foundational to achieve those priorities?
Thanks for the question. I would say that for Pacific Air Forces, the priorities that we have in line have to do with being ready to actually deploy in support of military operations in this theater, in support of our National Command Authority and Indo-Pacific Command. And with that, we have to have the ability to deploy our forces forward, to disperse them, to operate them from a wide variety of locations, hundreds of locations across a very wide, expansive theater. And be able to command and control those forces to conduct operations either for deterrence or if called upon to conduct operations in support of military combat. And with that, Icam capabilities at the edge is foundational to our abilities to do that mission.
So what does it look like today in your organization, and where should it be going for tomorrow?
Well, today we utilize our existing legacy network capabilities that authenticate based upon the existing technology we have. So what that looks like is each of the services has stovepipe networks that have data resident in them. We all authenticate to those networks separately. We can deploy forward with some capabilities. But what it looks like is the data itself is kind of stuck inside all of these little silos. So it's hard for that to move. And when it comes to our military force of being able to deploy, to mobilize, to move from site to site, from location to location and get access to that data, that is slow, manual, and cumbersome, and it actually slows down our military operations. That's what we have today. For tomorrow, here's what we really need. We need the next generation of identity, credentialing, and access management. It needs to be automated. It needs to be portable. It needs to be federated and survivable. It needs to work at the edge so that we can move our warfighters around and move the data to them where they need it to conduct operations and not the other way around. And the last thing I'll say is it has to be survivable in that environment, in a disconnected, degraded, latent environment, but also it has to be survivable against advanced cyber threats such as those that are posed by China and Russia.
Well, John, turning to you now, when we talk about Icam, what makes the C, the credentialing part, so important?
You know, that's a great question, because we used to talk about identity simply as identity and access management. And the C in Icam is really important because what it does is it focuses not only on who I am as a user, but some of the other facets associated with how I might be addressing myself and trying to access an environment. Things like, time of day, attributes like my security clearance and my role, but also things like location. I mean, if I live in Virginia and suddenly I'm logging in from Asia or North Africa, well, that might be a problem just because of time-space issues, right? Laws of physics dictate that I can't get into North Africa in a half an hour. So maybe where I'm logging in from is important as well. And that's why the C is so important, because what it represents is that multifaceted view of my identity associated with the credentials to which I'm entitled.
And John, ICAM is being implemented across the DoD at the enterprise level.
Yes.
The next step would really be to take that out and extend it to the edge. So first talk about the unique challenges in that environment at the edge.
Well, so as Colonel Cloud had mentioned, some of the issues associated with the edge are dealing with operating in a challenged environment and in a contested environment, which means that we have to be able to disconnect from that enterprise. We have to be able to operate independently, a franchise model, if you will, or a federated approach. So we have to be able to provide all of those services associated with that multifaceted credentialing decision point and policy enforcement at the edge, just like we would at the enterprise. So we have to be able to operate independently, but also cooperate with the enterprise. So we have this challenge of having to do both. And that's what makes ICAM at the edge. And even as we start to get mobile and think about ICAM on the move, this really becomes an interesting problem, not only from a technology perspective, but from a rule set and a policy perspective and how we deal with that from a governance side of things.
And Captain O'Donovan, you said earlier that there are 3 critical components of ICAM, including data tagging and data policy. Can you talk about a little bit more about that and what you see are the gaps in those issues now?
Absolutely. In the legacy systems, we relied a lot on the trust of the network. And if you access that network or access that application, it was expected and understood that you were able to then access the data resident on that network or within that application. As we move forward to zero trust and look to implement ICAM, the newer applications and newer capabilities coming online address that and ensure that data is tagged appropriately. Further challenge we're going to have moving forward is ensuring that we can then tag the data appropriately in existing systems and the data that is already resident on some of our networks. Continuing on and aligning to Colonel Cloud's example, looking at having the stovepipe services being able to access each other's data. And that's a critical component from a combatant command perspective, is ensuring that our warfighting forces across the services and across the components have access to the right data and the data they need at the right time.
And Colonel Cloud, the captain had mentioned the ability to manage security policies in theater. Can you talk a little bit about that and why those controls on that data need to be federated?
Yes. Well, as we all know, in the business of military operations, that is a team sport. So from Pacific Air Forces, our commander would be commanding not just Air Force forces, but those of the Joint Force. So the Army, Navy, Marine, Air, those of our allies and partners. So think of our big allies in this theater: Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Thailand, others. And in order to actually conduct those operations effectively, we have to be able to share information with each other at speed while we are all also operating dispersed. So it shouldn't matter if the data is resident on an aircraft carrier for the U.S. Navy or the Australian Navy, or a deployed forward Marine base, or Air Force forces dispersed across hundreds of islands in the Pacific theater. It is critically important for Federation so that we can access and move that data from where it is to where folks can action it so that we can fight and win.
And John, your thoughts on that, the challenges posed?
Yeah, as the Colonel mentioned, as we're dealing with in-theater operations and we have to cooperate with our coalition partners, work in a joint and interagency environment, data sharing becomes critical, but it's a challenge because that often means that we have to have multiple versions of the same document in order to affect that data sharing in a today type environment. ICAM, providing that at the edge, allows us to have that multifaceted credentialing decision point so that we can start to tag that data and have a single authoritative source so that we don't run into configuration management problems, but then parse that out and say, here's the information that I want to share with my UK partners. Here's the information I want to share with my Coast Guard partners. Here's the information I want to share to the Australians, and allow us to do that and effect the mission and accelerate mission effectiveness while still protecting the data and keeping it into a single authoritative source, which is critical if we want to secure the data.
Up next, managing sensors and other connected devices at the edge. We'll be right back.
CyberNation, Icam at the Edge is sponsored by GDIT. Learn more at gdit.com/Icam.
Welcome back. You're watching CyberNation, Icam at the Edge, sponsored by GDIT. I'm Mimi Gerges with the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network. Compromised credentials are the primary method adversaries use to breach networks today. Without zero trust, the potential surface area for attack is wide. As the department moves to implement JADC2, it's critical to have Icam in place. We're back with Colonel Don Cloud. He is Deputy Director of Cyberspace Operations for Pacific Air Forces. Captain Brett O'Donovan is Division Director, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and John Salen, Cyber Solutions Director for GDIT. John, when we talk about Icam, we're not just verifying users. Every device also has an identity. So what are what makes the credentialing of devices or sensors unique at the edge?
You know, when it comes to non-person entities, devices, sensors, drones, what have you, when we're thinking about machines, we have to consider that machines operate at machine speed. So any kind of latency, decision-making, things like that, we have to accelerate as much as possible so they can do their job, which is to operate at that line speed. So when credentialing machines, we have to think about the decision point in as quickly a decision as possible perspective, rather than focusing solely on the deep analysis of who they are, what they're trying to do. So we have to take a slightly different approach. We have to make sure that we maximize the ability to make those decisions quickly, get them to the connection points they need to, and make that happen, which is slightly different.
And can you give us a use case for a dispersed force, like in the Pacific, and how the location of devices is going to factor into Icam?
Sure. So if we're operating in a forward deployed location and need to focus on rapid introduction of new devices, for instance, a remote piloted vehicle, that sort of thing, we have to look at what the tactically relevant situation is and how do we prioritize what that device is doing. Sometimes a sensor like a closed circuit camera TV might be more or less of a priority than that feed from that remotely piloted vehicle. So we have to make those decisions at the local in-theater level, which is why federating the Icam solution point is so critical, because we have to be able to let those on-scene commanders make those decisions, give them the technology and the policy governance capability to make those decisions in situ so that they can do what makes most sense for the situation.
And Colonel Cloud, following on that, as the force begins to incorporate more sensors, how will Icam, unleash the data that's collected on the edge?
Yes, to piggyback on John's comments, I think probably two things. One, the ability to interconnect mobile warfighters, devices, applications, to be able to move data around to, let's say, defend widely dispersed forces against attack, and actually make those decisions faster and be able to share the data associated with air-based defense so we can launch fighters. Icam and the ability to move and secure that data while it's in motion to actually make air and missile defense decisions can critically enable and increase our survival. On the flip side, the ability to connect ad hoc sensors that we might connect from our allies and partners, from obviously members of the joint forces who are on the move, and create a common operating picture forward in the battle area that we could push out to everyone, to include special forces teams that are closely the front lines of the enemy, to our allies and partners, to forces afloat, to our combat air forces, would allow us to conduct offensive operations much more effectively. So I think really the asymmetric advantage that ICAM can provide is the machine-to-machine capabilities to be able to make decisions much faster than we can today, so we can overwhelm the enemy and survive and operate in an anti-access aerial denial environment.
And Captain, what about the issues of bandwidth and computing capacity when you're collecting that much data?
There are additional challenges on the overhead required for ICAM, because as you have zero trust, and it's beyond just accessing the network or the application one time, there's a continual verification process that is required to ensure that the user or the non-person entity accessing the data has that ability. So that back and forth between the policy and ensuring that the attributes match the data that is being accessed it will then cause some challenges with the disadvantaged users and SATCOM users with a combination of bandwidth constraints or increased latency impacting those forward users across the joint force.
John, how do you deal with those kinds of disadvantages and that the overhead requirements that the captain was just saying?
Well, this is all about prioritizing the traffic. And that's one of the things that an ICAM solution, as opposed to a previous identity solution, would help provide, because based on those multifaceted views of credentials and policies to which that individual or non-person entity has access to, you can actually use that to prioritize traffic, to move people into the fast lane, or to move those non-person entities, those sensors, into that fast lane and really get them through quickly. And that's where we need to start making those policy enforcement decisions so that we can prioritize traffic, prioritize transactions, not just a single network or a single communication type, but an individual transaction, and say this is the highest priority transaction right now for this mission. And that's how you can take advantage of that and use the data not only as a way to process information, but to use it as a way to make better decisions and accelerate the mission by providing a more a dynamic approach toward how do I manage.
So what happens when you have to disconnect from that enterprise ICAM that we were talking about earlier?
So that's where we need to make sure that we have the services at the local level that are necessary to allow those on-scene commanders to make those mission-relevant decisions and those policy decisions. So we need to make sure that we're not just relying on the enterprise to provide the identity and the credentialing and that policy enforcement. We have to push that policy enforcement capability down to the disconnected level, down to the edge, which is why we need to think of things a little differently as we're providing for those forward deployed units and those edge units, rather than at a global enterprise level.
And Colonel, can you give us a bit of an idea of the threat environment that you're dealing with out there in the Pacific? Obviously, China is going to be the pacing threat.
Yes, I'll focus on two capabilities. One, obviously, the Chinese military has modernized significantly over the past several decades. So they've been increasing their ability to hold our forces at risk, which is why we have to be able to operate in a dispersed fashion. That's increases in their naval presence and capabilities, increases in their air power capabilities, especially close to their shores, and increases in their cyber capabilities. So that they become more of a threat with regards to their ability to project air power, maritime superiority, as well as to hold at risk our operating locations. In addition, they've significantly invested in their cyber attack and espionage capabilities to be able to get into a variety of different networks. And it is important for ICAM, as part of Zero Trust, to better enable us to actually secure our data, as opposed to how we kind of do things now, which is perimeter-based network stovepipe defenses, which are not adequate to the task of countering an advanced adversary like China.
And John, given that advanced threat, you have said that it's more important to focus on resiliency rather than redundancy. Explain that and how that works into Icam.
So resiliency, as opposed to redundancy, is all about changing how we react to the situation at hand. Right? It's that idea that no plan survives first contact with the adversary, right? So redundancy is simply having multiple copies of the same security controls in place. And that's all well and good, but as we deal with these advanced threats, we have to be able to identify how they are approaching us, how they are exploiting our environment, and respond in a nimble and agile fashion. And providing a risk-adaptive, dynamic approach is really how we can be redundant, not only redundant, but resilient to those threats in theater.
Captain O'Donovan, I want to ask you about operating jointly. Obviously, the data needs to be interoperable. So what progress has Indo-PACOM made on its mission and partner environment, specifically with allies and partners?
So there are two components of what we're looking to do with our allies and partners right now. First, starting at the enterprise level, we're working very closely with the Mission Partner Capability Office on their delivery of the secret and below releasable environment, SABR, which is envisioned as the future data-centric environment for partner coordination at the communication level as well as at a mission application level. Beyond that, we're also looking to implement the zero trust principles, including Icam, on our current bilateral and multilateral networks. So we'll more easily be able to federate our partners in with the enterprise solution that is delivered with SABR. So we currently have multiple bilat and multilat environments. And with the delivery of SABR data centricity enabled by Icam, we'll be able to then operate and work in one environment and hopefully decrease the multiple files that John had talked about earlier in the show.
So, John, when we're talking about that granular level of access in dealing with joint operations with our allies and partners, how does that work? Because sometimes you want to give access on one mission and not on another.
Yeah, that's right. So when we think about compartmentalizing data and based on missions, for instance, you need to be able to provide that granular decision point. And that's where this data tagging comes into play that both Captain Donovan and Colonel Cloud had discussed. As we start working into these in-theater environments, how we share information and where we share that information becomes critical. And it's not something that you're going to be able to plan for necessarily at the beginning. You have a plan, but again, things are going to change. And suddenly we add in new partners that we didn't realize we'd have to coordinate with. So it's not only important to have the tagging, it's important to be able to update those tags so that we can add a new partner into a mission, read them into the program quickly, and then provide that sharing. Because Zero Trust and Icam is not only a way to protect data, it's a way to affect the mission by sharing that data when it's necessary.
And Colonel Cloud, as we've said, Icam is a fundamental enabler of Zero Trust. So what are the challenges to implementing Icam at the edge while the department is still so early in its Zero Trust transition?
I would characterize the two probably biggest challenges have to do with understanding and setting policies that change fundamentally how we actually allow information to be shared today across what we have as stovepipe networks and policy, whether they be political policies and agreements, bilateral, multilateral, or whether that's how we actually interconnect our networks today. So I think policy is probably number one, and trying to figure out what that right policy looks like that actually allows us to enable the mission and information sharing at speed while also protecting that data and protecting, let's say, the equities of our partners. Part two, I would say, is in this current environment, our allies and partners, as well as we, are adapting to more mobile maneuver warfare and operating in a much more dispersed environment. So the ability to have these policies pushed out to the edge, which is easy to say but hard to do, in a small form factor technologically that allows us to conduct the missions as we briefly spoken about, is probably the other challenge. Is how do you manifest that technologically at the edge to be able to enable that mission sharing of data.
And John, as the department begins to implement Icam, what does the on-ramp look like? Is this a fundamental shift, or is this more of an evolution?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a complete rip out and replace and this global shift all at once. It can be and should be done in an iterative fashion so that we build a little, learn a little, and check fire and move forward. That way, we can learn more about how each individual service, how each individual command needs Icam to work as we start pushing closer to the edge, and what those policies need to be, as the Colonel had mentioned, as we start to have differences in the maneuver warfare, right? Each individual operation area, each location, each theater, but also each service and agency is going to have their own nuances that we'll have to deal with. So doing it a little bit at a time in pockets to find out what works and then feeding that back into the overall plan is critical.
And Captain O'Donovan, are there additional system or hardware requirements that you're looking for to really implement Icam at the edge? And what do you most need from your industry partners?
So touching on some of the three key components that we were discussing previously is ways to ensure that we have multi-factor authentication and align the identity and the credentialing for the user. Follow on ensuring that we're able to tag data specifically in legacy systems to be able to leverage that. And then also hardware and software to be able to run that policy and to be able to expand that policy from the enterprise out to the tactical edge and have the capabilities to be able to ensure the right data is accessed by the right user, even in a austere or DDoS environment.
And Colonel Cloud, the same question to you. I mean, how can industry help in getting the DoD to where it needs to be for the future?
I think number one is to continue to partner with industry and the military to experiment on these capabilities in relevant battlefield situations so that we can learn together and identify the best of breed capabilities and then be able to take those and then scale them across the enterprise and across the tactical edge. The other, I would say, that we could probably use industry help on is advising us on advising us on effective strategies for incorporating our legacy systems and legacy data into this Icam framework until such time as they can be transitioned to a more data-centric, cloud-centric platform so that we can continue to increase our capability over time as opposed to try to big bang change the entire enterprise.
And John, finally to you, I mean, can the industry really meet those challenges given the limitations of DoD as far as speed and innovation and things like that?
Well, I absolutely think we can. And to borrow from what Colonel Cloud had just said, it's a partnership and it requires a partnership perspective. So there are a lot of ways we can do that outside of the old school DAU 3,500 individual shall statement type requirements, right? We can use vehicles like other transaction authorities and small business innovation research efforts to provide that experimentation capability, build a little, learn a little, provide feedback, and gradually get better. But because this is so important to execute a mission, in order to accelerate that mission and provide that dynamic security capability, we need to focus less on shall statements and hardcore requirements, focus on user stories. I am an operator in field. What does a day in the life of a mission look like? And then allow us to work together in partnership to figure out how to execute that mission. I think that's the key to making all of this work.
And thank you for watching CyberNation Icam at the Edge, sponsored by GDIT. For more information on the subject matter we discussed today, go to govmatters.tv/cybernation and scroll down to Icam at the Edge. For the Government Matters Thought Leadership Network, I'm Mimi Gerges.